I've experienced something very strange over the past few months. I think it all started back maybe, 5 months ago when I was reading a book, very scary little book actually, by Aldous Huxley called Brave New World. I recommend it if you haven't read it already, but that's not what this video is about. Um, well, it's in a way where this video starts, obviously, but so this book brought an interesting perspective to my life because it introduced the idea of a utopia and described it in a level of technological and scientific detail that I could actually understand at the time, sort of what the point was, right? And I think the point of that, at least what I got out of that, among other things, is that there's more to life than just a utopia. That if we could choose to live in this perfect utopia, and if that was all there ever was in life, then, well, maybe it wouldn't be life, right? If everything is perfect, then obviously nothing goes wrong. If nothing goes wrong, there's nothing to reason about. If there's nothing to reason about, there's no reason and no rationality and no thought. And then we're not there to appreciate the perfect world in which we exist. So Huxley introduced this idea of a utopia, and that really got something started in my mind. And it took a few months to germinate. As time went on, I really tried to focus on other things, but it was always there in the back of my mind. Well, naively, I assumed prior to reading this that maybe utopia was something to something to look forward to, something to, have at the end of life. Like after I die, maybe utopia would be something that I would experience. But after reading that book, it really turned my assumptions in the widest sense on their head because, well, obviously, I don't want to experience a utopia. That doesn't seem like a great place to live after all. And so I wasn't really sure at that point, well, what's going to happen after my life is over? What's going to happen after my death? And I think this is something that everybody knows logically from a young age just because of the vast amounts of information in the world in which we live, right? The average human will live for, about 80 years, and it varies, of course, a lot. But um, the average human lives for about that time, and we know how many years old we are usually in our modern world with all the information we have. And so, logically, we know that, like, well, life is not going to last forever. And I even remember being young and thinking, okay, well, if I'm 10 and life could be, I could live to be 100 if I'm a good person and I take care of myself, then I guess I'm 10% of the way there, right? And never thought to ask myself where there was, never stopped to really appreciate the fact of my own mortality or the imminent eventuality of my own death. So that's a pretty profound thing to start with, I think. And that's what really started to brew in my mind after I read Aldous Huxley's scary little book there. So I read that, and it wasn't for a few months that I really had reason once again to contemplate the philosophical realm, but it was a few months after that that I finally got to try this AI, this Chat GPT program, which is, making its rounds as this sort of artificial intelligence, quote unquote. And, I've talked about that a little bit in the past, but that really caused me to do some reflecting as well about the nature of existence and consciousness and life, and you know eventually, logically, after that, death and the things that happen during that process. This sort of continuous process of life. So one of the first places my mind went when I was thinking about this is obviously the natural curiosity. Well, I'm going to die at some point. That's something that, you know, well, difficult to accept, but it entered my mind, and it didn't enter my mind from like a logical perspective, like, oh well, I'm this many years old, and it wasn't elementary like that. It was the philosophical and existential time around this time where now that thought entered my mind for real as an internal, as something I had started at that point to internalize. That was one of the most difficult things I think that I've ever done. You think in these terms, and a lot of things in your world can change. Um, you start to question, well, what is the context in which you exist? Where were you born? What life were you born into? What happened before that in your frame of reference? And you can try to think back, but you can only think back so far. You can't remember, you know, in fact, memory itself doesn't serve you for um, for the entirety of the time you're here. It doesn't serve you when you're asleep. It doesn't serve you when you're very young, and it doesn't even serve you with complete accuracy. So the nature of your reality is obviously governed by this inconsistent thing called memory that you use to reflect on the past and the things you've done, the choices you've made, the people you've talked to, the world around you, the things you've experienced through your life, and that occurred to me next. That was really scary, right? The the shaky grounds on which I perceive the world, and on which the foundation of my perception for sort of what the universe is, right? The shaky grounds on which all of that is based, that that was terrifying when I first realized that. And I was also terrified by the unknown of, well, what's going to happen after life itself. And so, of course, there is the logical progression of, well, okay, so biologically speaking, after we are dead, the things that used to make up our physical bodies then turn into something else and become part of the world or the universe in some other way, the objective world or universe, the one that we physically exist in, the one that allows us to interact with one another, the one that upholds the laws of rationality and physics that permit us to interoperate with one another in a consistent and scientifically defined manner, right? Um, so so that world, um, that world in which we exist, started to become all encompassing for me at some point. And I was, well, okay, if this is where things go, that's obviously really scary, right? Because the naive thing is, well, you don't really think about anything. You're not really truly aware of your own mortality, right? You don't perceive yourself as immortal. You don't think you're going to live forever, but you just don't. You're not aware. So in becoming aware, that's really one of the definitions of the human experience, right? As humans, we become aware of our own eventual demise and our own mortality. And then we have a choice as to, well, okay, once we're aware of this, what are we going to do, right? Because it's a very tangible reality. I mean, you exist in the world, I exist in the world. And we can communicate with one another about these ideas because we both think and exist in this world in a certain way. And so from that foundation, I mean, people interact, they influence one another, they shape the course of life itself, as they have children, as they think, useful thoughts that certainly serve to benefit people over time, such as, well, gosh, we could get we could get ammonia and get fertilizer, and we have all of these different things for growing food that can improve the livelihoods of people. We also think some terrible thoughts, such as the ones that lead to to mass killings and genocide and all of these bad things, right? But as time went on, all of these things, all of these thoughts, they started to just rip through my mind like tornadoes or something. And it was a really uncontrollable process. And that's really where my journey into the crisis of not knowing about mortality and immortality and death, that's really where that journey began. And I think it's a journey that everybody who lives long enough to experience will come to appreciate as they go through it, because at that point, it gives life a new dimension. It shows some of the ephemerality of our physical presence, but also the profound nature of the world in which we exist, and the implications of the actions which we can take over time, right? There's no moving back in time, there's no undoing the past. And so, life is going to move forward. And I guess it's just a question individually, and collectively, I suppose, but I would say individually more so, what are you going to do with this knowledge, right? What is each individual person going to do with the knowledge of their own eventual demise? And how are you going to come to grips with that? How is that going to serve you well, right? Because I think when we reflect internally, we can derive some level of knowledge about, it would be good if I got up out of bed today and started to prepare my breakfast, or got to work on time, or got my clothes on after before I leave my house, right? There are things that we know are good. And that doesn't come from this existential, the ultimate widest scope of understanding. It comes from something internal. When we reflect about the nature of what it would be good to do or focus on, or a decision that needs to be taken about something in our day-to-day lives, right? In our tangible and concrete reality. That type of thing, I think, it comes from what we can ask ourselves. And so it begs the question then, we must exist in this context, in this way we exist now, in this physical world where we communicate with one another, where the decisions we make, whether for good or for ill, will impact other people in the world, at least to a certain extent. And those are things that we do not control. We do control the time we have in this world. And I think that what this process of reckoning about our own sort of mortality does, is it serves to really, really harden and solidify some of the decisions that we might make about, things important to us as individuals in this world, right? Because we're not here forever, but obviously we connect with people who were here before us, and also we connect with people who will be here after us. And so if we can act as a conduit between the past and the future, if we can learn from those who are going to leave here before we think we will, and if we can then in turn pass that knowledge on to those who will be here after we think we will, those who we think will outlast us, then, we did something. We did something for the context in which we now find ourselves. We did something to affect this physical world in which we find ourselves. And because we exist here, and because this is our frame of reference, we should come to accept that benefiting the people who will come after us is a good thing. Learning from the people who have come before us and using our own discretion as to which of that information ought to be passed down to the future. That process of distilling good from evil and of passing down that which ought to be passed down, that process is a good thing. Because we don't know the ultimate end that this physical world, this context in which we must operate, in which we currently operate, we don't know the end to which it is heading. But if we search internally to ourselves, we can learn something about what we should do in order to get there. And that's what I've come to realize, is that life is not forever. It is not a utopia, but it is an adventure. It is something that we can control to a certain extent. We don't control the nature of existence. We don't control the nature of the physical world, the laws of physics. We don't get to turn off gravity just by willing that it is so. But we do get to connect with the people who are here. We do get to learn from them. We do get to interact with them. We do get to create tools that facilitate better interaction. And we do get to use the tools that have been given to us for the best of purposes that we know how. And in doing that, we can find some level, and it's not a complete, it's never going to be a complete fulfillment, because I don't believe that a person can be fulfilled until after they are gone. But we can find a level of satisfaction in knowing that we are headed towards fulfillment, and that fulfillment will be in service to the ends of that entity which has defined the framework by which the physical world exists, right? And I'm not saying that's God. I mean, some people believe it's God. I think I believe it is, but it's not a requirement. I mean, if you believe that we live in a simulation and that our physical world is just, somebody spun up a program in Node.js and passed in some environment variables for those programmers out there to stipulate the laws of physics, or we're just in a simulation that was set up by somebody on their computer. If you believe that, well, then the person who set up that simulation has some goal of some kind, whether it's their own entertainment or whether the simulation is in service to some other end. But the point is, by benefiting this context in which we exist, by learning from the people that have come before us, by connecting with the people that we think will outlast us, and by providing them with our experience, such as me recording this video to sort of recount this acknowledgement and reckoning of my own mortality and eventual death, which is a difficult topic. Well, people can learn from that. People can use that as a way to not help as much as just guide their future, their inevitable progression of life. Because the progression of your life is inevitable. You don't control that either. But you do control the nature. You do control the nature of its progression to a certain extent by the decisions that you make. And those decisions can be, well, they can be a lot of things. They can be scary. They can be easy. They can be ignored. But you can You can choose the nature by which your life progresses. You can't avoid its progression, though. You can't stop time, and you can't cease the progression of time. Of course, there is the possibility for you to cease the progression of life, but there again, it seems as though that would not be in service to the ends by which our existence has been defined. Because in putting us here and giving us tools, in giving us the capacity to learn and to teach and to reason, we have the capacity to influence the environment around us. And in terminating the process of life, whether that of ourselves or of others, of course, we lose that capacity or we take that capacity. And that is not in service to the goals of this existence in which we have been created, or in which we find ourselves. And so we then find ourselves with a lot of questions and a lot of unknowns, but once you can reconcile the widest context in which your mind will allow you to operate, then maybe things become a little bit easier. And so there are difficult things, there are easy things, but really we find ourselves here for a limited amount of time, and we should choose to maximize our effects on those around us, on this context in which we exist, so that as time goes on, well, it leads to a greater understanding for the future about the ways in which we have existed over time and the ways in which it is possible to exist, at least the choices that people have made in the past which have led to various modes of existence, right? So for example, a bad person does a bad thing, they make a bad choice, they end up suffering some consequence, right? And you can learn from that. You don't have to make that same choice. That's a profound concept in and of itself, because it wasn't your experience, but now you suspect, at least, and you have reason to believe that in making that same choice in similar circumstances, you might be subject to the same result. And so that's almost refreshing in a sense, because it brings a certain cohesion to the nature of reality itself. And it allows us to rejoice in the fact that everybody here is subject to these same constraints and to the same rules that define this context, this physical existence, right? I mean, of course, from a purely scientific perspective, humans evolved over a long time and were pretty similar. And so, if there are one set of rules that govern the things that happen in this realm, there are likely also one set of rules that govern the things that will happen in the next. And those rules seem to be fairly cohesive, at least in this realm. And so, while we don't know, if it's any assurance, if rationality is cohesive across these different contexts of existence, it seems as though it would follow that the realm in which we would find ourselves afterwards ought also be somewhat cohesive, in the sense that, well, A follows from B, right? And from that point, you have causality, you have reason. And that doesn't mean that we get to run around saying we're going to be immortal, because we're not. You can't remember what happened before you were born. If you were immortal, I think you would have some sense of, well, you know, in my several billion or so years of experience, or however many years you want to define, right? You would be able to reflect back on that. So I think that things that make up our minds are not necessarily immortal, but that gets into the existence of a soul. Do I believe there's a soul? Well, I think there's something that causes for us to be aware of the world around us, obviously, because we are aware of it. And what follows from that is, well, are we always aware of the things around us? When I go to sleep at night, I'm not aware of the things that happen when I'm unconscious. And yet when I wake up, I become aware again. And that's a fascinating concept in and of itself. My awareness, my reality just doesn't exist for a while. But is that painful? Is that existentially painful? Do we suffer from, some people do. Some people have a difficulty trying to sleep because they don't know what's going to happen while they're asleep. But generally, I mean, sleep isn't existentially painful, and I don't know if we have any closer analog than that to death, but it seems as though as time goes on, people get a better understanding of this. And that understanding can be scary, but for me, it started from Huxley and his scary little book, and then it went forward with some of the developments in AI and causing me to contemplate the nature of consciousness and existence and other things as well. So in closing, I guess I would say that people who don't like to feel existential pain, but who do, such as myself, people who suffer from a fear of ultimate demise on an existential level, just wanted to put some of these thoughts out here because, well, I believe that I can find meaning in this life in making people suffer less, in reducing the suffering that exists in the world. We all know what suffering is. I think that's pretty universal. And I think it's pretty universally bad. I mean, generally speaking. So, by trying to get rid of suffering, not in pursuit of a utopia, but in pursuit of facilitating the most optimal chances at having a good adventure in this life and in helping people, which can be seen as a valuable thing, well, it might make people have a better experience, right? Not the ultimate, just eternal happiness, because that's actually not a very good experience. I mean, if you're just eternally happy all the time, that wouldn't serve you very well in the long term. But in creating this, I hope to allow people to overcome that sort of existential fear, and in that, I mean, from that point forward, it's well, it's then about living. It's then about finding the best way to operate in this context. Because when you can come to accept the ephemerality of life itself, when you can come to accept the nature of existence as something you don't understand fully, but something in which you participate, and something in which you can have an influence, then you'll really start to unleash your true potential as an individual. And you'll be able to exist and live and love in ways that you never before realized. So I'll leave it there. I think it's certainly an interesting thing to reflect on, and part of making this for me has been coming to terms with this and coming to accept it. And I hope that I can help facilitate that process for others as well. Thank you.